Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The World's Last Night. My name is James Thayer, and today I'm not in Exodus. I am actually going to be reading an essay by C.S. Lewis titled The World's Last Night. Now, I'm not going to read the entire essay. I'm only going to read the portion of it that first caught my eye. And the first time I actually read, quotes, this essay was actually viewing a YouTube video, a C.S. Lewis doodle that's the author called The World's Last Night. And if you haven't already seen it, I totally suggest you go check it out, because basically this guy draws doodles as the narrator reads some works by C.S. Lewis. And the doodles really help you translate what he's trying to say into modern day, thought and imagery. It really helps you understand C.S. Lewis. So you're not going to get that from this podcast. So that's why I recommend that. But I am going to read this because I think that this essay is one of my favorites of C.S. Lewis's. I love what it has to say about the end of the world because it reframes it. Usually when people talk about the end of the world, they put it in the frame of like death and despair and the whole scene melting away. And C.S. Lewis writes about sort of like apocalyptic stuff in other essays. But what he's really trying to get at in this essay is that the average Christian should not really busy themselves about the end of the world. It's not something that we should always have on our mind and fear. And at the same time, he argues it's something we should always have on our mind. And I'm going to let him explain what he means by that. But this is very interesting and a very unique. And I love how this little passage starts off by talking about this character in a play called King Lear. And so I'm going to start there. All right. So this is what C.S. Lewis writes. He says, "In King Lear, there is a man who is such a minor character that Shakespeare has not given him even a name. He is merely called First Servant. All the characters around him, Regan, Cornwall, and Edmund, have fine long-term plans. They think they know how the story's going to end, and they are quite wrong. The servant has no such delusions. He has no notion how the play's going to go, but he understands the present scene. He sees an abomination, the blinding of old Gloucester, I don't know how you pronounce it, Gloucester, taking place. He will not stand it. His sword is out and pointed at his master's breast in a moment. Then Regan stabs him dead from behind. That's his whole part. 8 lines all told. But if it were real life and not a play, that is a part it would be best to have acted." And I get chills when I read about that, because it summarizes it summarizes how you're going to go to heaven and you're going to meet heroes who none of us have ever heard of. Because we don't know people's internal struggles, the role they're going to play in this life. We don't know how much knowledge they have, what giftings, talents, treasures they have, but God does, and he sees how they use them. And so Lewis is talking about this play where you have all these huge characters and they're given names and they have long-term big plans for how the story should go. But he focuses on this first servant who isn't even given a name by Shakespeare. And yet, in the one scene he has of importance, which is going to be the end of his life, what he does in that one scene defines him as a character and basically typifies his righteousness. And Lewis argues that if this were real life, this play, you don't want to be these kings, these other characters. Instead, you want to be first servant who understands what's going on in the present and acts accordingly in the character of Christ. He sees an injustice occurring and he goes to try to stop it, and he dies for trying to stop it. And Lewis is going to use this as teaching us as an image of how we should live our lives, always being present-minded about what we are doing currently and being able to be proud of what we're doing currently. Okay, I'm going to keep reading. The doctrine of the second coming. And by the way, guys, the second coming, first coming of Christ would have been when he was born to Mary, and then he died. He was resurrected. Well, he always promised he would come back. And in Revelation, we see a picture of what that's like. So the doctrine of the second coming is about him when he returns. And the gist is, that's going to be the end of this world. He's going to bring the end with him. And he's going to establish a new kingdom on a new earth. So here we go. The doctrine of the second coming teaches us that we do not and cannot know when the world drama will end, which this is true. Jesus several times in Scripture said no man can guess when he's going to come back. So, if you are the kind that likes to, believe people when they're saying Jesus is coming back on April the 17th, 20, whatever, don't. There's no reason to. Jesus himself said that no one can guess when he's coming back. And false prophets and false churches have predicted this kind of stuff for ages. And have always been wrong. And Jesus even says they're going to be wrong. So why even try? Lewis continues, the curtain may be rung down at any moment, say, before you have finished reading this paragraph. Which I have like 3 more sentences in this paragraph. So Jesus comes back by the time I finish this paragraph. I'm sorry you don't get to hear the rest of this, but it's a good thing. So many things would be interrupted. Perhaps you are going to get married next month. Perhaps you are going to get a raise next week. You may be on the verge of a great scientific discovery. You may be maturing great social and political reforms. Surely no good and wise God would be so very unreasonable as to cut all this short, not now, of all moments. And when I was younger, in college, specifically early college and late high school, I always thought, I don't want Jesus to come back now because I want to experience being married first. And so me then would agree with this caricature that C.S. Lewis has created of someone who says, no, I got all these plans coming up. I don't want the end of the world to come now. Now, after my second year of college, I changed my tune very quickly, and I look forward to the day Jesus comes back. I don't need any more experiences on earth. All right, we'll continue. He says, but we think thus because we keep on assuming that we know the play. We do not know the play. We do not even know whether we are in Act 1 or Act 5. We don't know who are the major and who are the minor characters. The author knows. The audience, if there is an audience, if angels and archangels in the company of heaven fill the pit and the stalls, may have an inkling, but we never seeing the play from outside, never meeting any characters except the tiny minority who are on in the same scene as ourselves, wholly ignorant of the future and very imperfectly informed about the past, cannot tell at what moment the end ought to come. So Lewis is comparing the drama of our lives to a play. God is the author of the play. He's, Shakespeare or whatever. The audience would be angels and, angelic beings who have sort of a glimpse about how the play is going on, but not sort of a fuzzy picture. And I love how he basically says that, we're ignorant and we only can interact with the characters that are on at the same time as us. I mean, during your lifetime, you only see so many people. You only get to read about certain people in the past, and you have sort of a foggy, hazy idea about what they contributed in the play and how that brought you here. And then you have no foreshadowing of the future because you haven't stood outside the play and seen it before. It's unfolding currently. And so he's talking about our life. Okay. And then he basically says, so therefore you can't tell when the play is going to come to an end. He continues to write, that it will come when it ought, we may be sure, but we waste our time in guessing when that will be. That it has a meaning, we may be sure, but we cannot see it. When it is over, we may be told. We are led to expect that the author will have something to say to each of us on the part that each of us has played. The playing it well is what matters infinitely. So if you've ever been to a play, like I did musicals in high school, if you've ever been to a play, a lot of times not the author in high school plays, but the director gives you feedback on how you're doing. How are you playing your part? And maybe at the end of the play, you might get feedback from the audience and from everyone else about how you did. How, are you going to get an accolade? Is your we always had awards at the end of plays. I always got loudest backstage. It's not a good award to get. But the director hands those out. How did you do? How did you do your part? So he's basically saying that we're led to expect that God, at the end of our lives, is going to tell us how we did with the talent, the resources, the time, the life we were given. How did we do? I mean, were we given a lot, like maybe one of the kings in the play? And did we squander that lot? Or maybe we weren't given hardly anything and we were a servant or a slave. Well, did we at least play our part, like first servant in King Lear, to do something righteous with the little bit of power we had, even if it cost us our life? God's going to parse all that out upon our deaths and give us a review about how we played. All right, Lewis continues. The doctrine of the second coming, then, is not to be rejected because it conflicts with our favorite modern mythology. It is, for that very reason, to be the more valued and made more frequently the subject of meditation. It is the medicine our condition especially needs. And with that, I turn to the practical. There's a real difficulty in giving this doctrine the place which it ought to have in our Christian life without, at the same time, running a certain risk. So he's basically saying that we need to keep the doctrine of the second coming in mind at all times. But he says there's a risk if you start to do that. And he's going to explain what that risk is. The fear of that risk probably deters many teachers who accept the doctrine from saying very much about it. He's saying that a lot of pastors, preachers may not talk about the second coming of Christ because of the fear of the risk of preaching about it. He continues, we must admit at once that this doctrine has, in the past, led Christians into very great follies. So the second coming of Christ, the doctrine has really led many Christians down terrible paths. And I think one of the things he's going to talk about is fire and brimstone teaching, fear-based teaching. All right, apparently many people find it difficult to believe in this great event without trying to guess its date, or even without accepting as certainty the date that any quack or hysteric offers them. So I know people like this that just constantly want to try to guess when the end of the world is happening, and even though Jesus says they're not going to. And so they look for the signs and they look, for all these things to try to guess this time that Jesus himself said you're not going to be able to guess. And Lewis calls this a folly. To write a history of all these exploded predictions would need a book, and a sad, sordid, tragic comical book it would be. So there's been several people in the past that have tried to predict the coming of Jesus and have been wrong. One such prediction was circulating when St. Paul wrote his second letter to the Thessalonians. Someone had told them that the day was at hand. This was apparently having the result which such predictions usually have. People were idling and playing the busybody. One of the most famous predictions was that of poor William Miller in 1843. Miller, whom I take to have been an honest fanatic, dated the second coming to the year, the day, and the very minute. A timely comet fostered the delusion. Thousands waited for the Lord at midnight on March 21st and went home to a late breakfast on the 22nd, followed by the jeers of a drunkard. Clearly, no one wishes to say anything that will reawaken such mass hysteria. We must never speak to simple, excitable people about the day. And when he says the day, he's talking about when Jesus comes back, without emphasizing again and again the utter impossibility of prediction. We must try to show them that the impossibility is an essential part of the doctrine. If you do not believe our Lord's words, why do you believe in his return at all? He's basically saying, look, it's hypocritical, contradictory to believe that Jesus is coming back, because he said he's coming back, right? And then to at the same time believe you can predict when he's coming back, even though he explicitly told you he couldn't. It's like you're double-minded there if you're trying to do both things, even though Jesus gave you both things. One you are to believe and the other one you're not to believe. Okay. And if you do believe, then must you not put away from you utterly and forever any hope of dating that return? His teaching on the subject quite clearly consisted of 3 propositions. 1, that he will certainly return. 2, that we cannot possibly find out when. 3, and that therefore we must always be ready for him. Note the therefore, precisely because we cannot predict the moment. We must be ready at all moments. So Lewis is arguing, and Jesus argued, that it's actually because of the doctrine that we cannot predict when he comes back. It's actually important because that makes it to where we are always ready for him to return. Our Lord repeated this practical conclusion again and again, and if the promise of the return had been made for the sake of this conclusion alone, as if the promise of the return had been made for the sake of this conclusion alone. Lewis is reading into things. Doesn't mean it's true, but he's basically saying that it's almost as if the reason Jesus is coming back, the promise of the return, is so that you will always be ready for the return. All right, Lewis goes on to write, watch is the burden of his advice. I shall come like a thief. You will not know. I most solemnly assure you, you will not see me approaching. If the householder had known at what time the burglar would arrive, he would have been ready for him. If the servant had known when his absent employer would come home, he would not have been found drunk in the kitchen. But they didn't. Nor will you. Therefore, you must be ready at all times. The point is surely simple enough. The schoolboy does not know what part of his Virgil lesson he will be made to translate. Virgil, guys, is an author. He wrote, I think, the Aeneid, which is actually pretty good. Okay. So the schoolboy does not know what part of his Virgil lesson he will be made to translate. That is why he must be prepared to translate any passage. The sentry does not know at what time an enemy will attack, or an officer inspect his post. That is why he must keep wake all the time. The return is wholly unpredictable. There will be wars and rumors of wars and all kinds of catastrophes, and there always are. Things will be, in that sense, normal. The hour before the heavens roll up like a scroll. You cannot guess it. If you could, one chief purpose for which it was foretold would be frustrated, and God's purposes are not so easily frustrated as that. One's ears should be closed against any future William Miller in advance. If a William Miller comes along, someone predicting the end of Jesus, just cut him off. Don't believe him. Like, in advance, you automatically know, don't listen to that person. That's what Lewis is arguing. The folly of listening to him at all is almost equal to the folly of believing him. He couldn't know what he pretends or thinks he knows. Of this folly, George MacDonald has written well. Do those, he asks, who say, "Lo, here," or "Lo, there," are the signs of his coming, think to be too keen for him and spy his approach? When he tells them to watch, lest he find them neglecting their work, they stare this way and that. Watch, lest he should succeed in coming like a thief. Obedience is the one key of life. Okay, the Old English makes it hard to think about, but it's actually really funny if you go back and read it again. He's basically saying, like, do people who continue to try to guess when Jesus is coming, are they like trying to outsmart Jesus, who promised to come like a thief so you wouldn't know when he came? Like, are they trying to like block him, like find him before that so he couldn't do what he told us he would do? It's funny. All right. The doctrine of the second coming has failed so far as we are concerned if it does not make us realize that at every moment of every year in our lives dawns question, what if this present or the world's last night is equally relevant? So something that Lewis had earlier in this essay I did not read is this guy named Donne, D-O-N-N-E. He asks this question, what if this present, so right now, were the world's last night? Which opens up a lot of questions about what would you do? What does that mean for society, for people, for families, for Christians, for non-Christians? I'll keep reading. Lewis writes, sometimes this question has been pressed upon our minds with the purpose of exciting fear. I do not think that is its right use. I am indeed far from agreeing with those who think all religious fear barbarous and degrading and demand that it should be banished from the spiritual life. Perfect love, we know, casts out fear, but so do several other things like ignorance, alcohol, passion, presumption, and stupidity. It is very desirable that we should all advance to that perfection of love in which we shall fear no longer. But it is very undesirable until we have reached that stage that we should allow any inferior agent to cast out our fear. The objection to any attempt at perpetual trepidation about the second coming is, in my view, quite a different one. So he's basically saying, he's about to argue against using the doctrine of the second coming to instill fear in people, and he's basically saying that there's an issue with people who are constantly fearful of the second coming, and he's going to outline that. The objection of any attempt at perpetual trepidation or fear, right, about the second coming is, in my view, quite a different one, namely, that it will certainly not succeed. Fear is an emotion, and it's quite impossible, even physically impossible, to maintain any emotion for very long. A perpetual excitement of hope about the second coming is impossible for the same reason. Crisis feeling of any sort is essentially transitory. Feelings come and go, and when they come, a good use can be made of them. They cannot be our regular spiritual diet. So emotions are good for the moments, but they can't be what we constantly make decisions based off of and consume and even emote. He's saying it's actually physically impossible to do that. What is important is not that we should always fear or hope about the end, but that we should always remember, always take it into account. An analogy may here help. A man of 70 need not be always feeling, much less talking, about his approaching death. But a wise man of 70 should always take it into account. He would be foolish to embark on schemes which presuppose 20 more years of life. He would be criminally foolish not to have made long since his will. Now what death is to each man, the second coming is to the whole human race. We all believe, I suppose, that a man should sit loose to his own individual life, should remember how short, precarious, temporary, and provisional a thing it is, should never give all his heart to anything which will end when his life ends. What modern Christians find it harder to remember is that the whole life of humanity in this world is also precarious, temporary, provisional. So, in that passage, he's basically saying that you say you're 70 years old and you know that, your death is impending or whatever. Like, it's not something that you should constantly be talking about, thinking about. It shouldn't constantly be on your mind, but it should be on your mind. That's what he's saying. And you should make smart, wise decisions because you have that information, such as leaving a will for your family, right? Well, he's basically saying, well, sometimes people get that part, but what they don't understand is that the whole life of humanity, because of the doctrine of the coming of Christ, is temporary, provisional, precarious, are the words he uses. In other words, don't give your whole life to something like forming the perfect nation, government, things that are going to be burned down anyways one day. Rather do what Scripture says and keep your mind on heavenly things. Now, you still do those other things, but you do them while keeping in mind that one day they will burn down and no longer exist. And hopefully that informs your decisions so you are careful about what you're willing to sacrifice in order to achieve those things. A very, crude example would be your career. Trying to build a Disney or, something that you've hurled your whole life into that will one day burn down and you can't take it with you to heaven. So be understanding of what the second coming of Christ means for society as a whole. All right. Any moralist will tell you that the person... and back to creating that empire like a Disney or whatever, be careful what you're willing to sacrifice for it. Whether that be your family, your faith, things that are more important to have a lasting legacy into eternity. All right. Any moralist will tell you that the personal triumph of an athlete or of a girl at a ball is transitory. And a ball, I'm assuming he's talking about a dance. Okay. The point is to remember that an empire or a civilization is also transitory. All achievements and triumphs, insofar as they are merely this worldly achievements and triumphs, will come to nothing in the end. Most scientists here join hands with the theologians. The earth will not always be habitable. Man, though longer lived than men, is usually mortal. The difference is that whereas the scientists expect only a slow decay from within, we reckon with sudden interruption from without at any moment. What if this present were the world's last night? Taken by themselves, these considerations might seem to invite a relaxation of our efforts for the good of posterity. But if we remember that what may be upon us at any moment is not merely an end, but a judgment, they should have no such result. They may and should correct the tendency of some moderns to talk as though duties to posterity were the only duties we had. I can imagine no man who will look with more horror at the end than a conscientious revolutionary who has, in a sense, sincerely been justifying cruelties and injustices inflicted on millions of his contemporaries by the benefits which he hopes to confer on future generations who, as one terrible moment now reveals to him, were never going to exist. A lot of big words in there. I will sum it up for you. He's basically saying that, okay, if you're thinking about all these things, this might actually invite you to relax your efforts on this earth, right? But he basically then goes on to say, but you need to keep in mind that the end is not merely an end, but it's a judgment. So the time that you spend on earth is important. You must spend it to do good things. And then he goes on to say, and this is like, they need to preach this everywhere because of what we've experienced in our last century. But he goes on to talk about a revolutionary who, has sincerely been justifying cruelties and injustices on millions of his contemporaries because he wants to confer some hope on a future generation, right? So you can think about Stalin hauling off all the kulaks, which were like peasant farmers, off to the gulags to die from working, the work camps, in order to redistribute their land to poorer people. So what did Stalin justify? Well, he justified those cruelties because why? He wanted to create what he thought was a better nation for a future generation. But he used people to do that. And what Lewis is writing is, well, I can't imagine being in a worse position than being that person who did all these evil things and they justified it because of some future idea. And then Jesus comes back before any future generations are even born, and they are now faced with all the injustice that they committed on earth, a judgment for it, for a future generation that would never even exist. So chew on that for a little bit. We'll keep going. Then he will see the massacres, the faked trials, the deportations to be all ineffaceably too smart for me, to be all real, an essential part, his part in the drama that has just ended, while the future utopia had never been anything but a fantasy. Frantic administration of panaceas to the world, and that's another word I don't even know what that means, is certainly discouraged by the reflection that this present might be the world's last night. Sober work for the future, within the limits of ordinary morality and prudence, is not. For what comes is judgment. Happy are those whom it finds laboring in their vocations, whether they were merely going out to feed the pigs or laying good plans to deliver humanity 100 years hence from great evil. The curtain has indeed now fallen. Those pigs will never in fact be fed. The great campaign against white slavery or governmental tyranny will never in fact proceed to victory. No matter, you were at your post when the inspection came. So, let me define white slavery for you. That's sex slavery. You can look it up. That's what they used to call sex trafficking. That last line there gets me, like actually chokes me up a little bit. The no matter, you were at your post when the inspection came. This essay continues to go on, but this is all I'm going to read. You can read more of this essay. It's all really, really good on your own time. It's called The World's Last Night, and it's in the book The World's Last Night and Other Essays. It's the very last essay in that book. But what Lewis is saying is whether or not in your life you're doing something as mundane as about to go feed the pigs, or you're laboring to deliver humanity from cancer or some other evil, or say you're doing something like trying to free people from a tyrannical government or free people from sex slavery, something good and great that you've put your life into. He's basically saying, don't fret if those plans never come to fruition and Jesus comes back. And the reason being, he says, no matter, you were at your post when the inspection came. And that really, for me, simplifies what my duties are on earth. And it's one of the reasons why I really love this essay. It means that I need to live every day in the present and actually be doing good in my present. Be like that first servant who lost his life, but he was doing good up until that very last moment. And if Jesus came back into that play at that time, out of all the people in that room, he's the one that would get the good report from the director, from the author of the play. And this really takes a lot of pressure off me to understand that I'm only in control of so much, and what matters is what I'm doing now, not necessarily what I'm missing out on achieving and what I could possibly achieve in the future, but rather every moment of every day I need to be thinking about who I am, what I'm doing, and whether it glorifies God. And I need to repeat that every day. So this breaking this down of the doctrine of the second coming of Jesus is actually very freeing to me. It means that you don't have to worry about when Jesus comes back. Like, you can't guess it anyways. Don't worry about that. You don't have to cure cancer, but you should work toward it. This is what Lewis would argue. And if Jesus comes back and all your plans never come to fruition, it doesn't matter. You were at your post. When he came to inspect whether or not you were sleeping on the job, you were awake and you were in his will. That's what matters. So the reason I named a website after this, and a website where I post essays and blogs about politics and theology and culture, was really because I wanted to always remember that the fight of intellectualism to try to change the world through writing, politics, whatever, at the end of the day, doesn't mean near as much as the people you interact with. Because how you treat people, as opposed to ideas, actually has an eternal consequence, because they have souls that will one day go to heaven or hell. And so I named my blog that as a reminder that whenever I debate people, any idea I have about what a perfect government would be, or, perfect virtue or whatever, it has to take a back seat to how I actually treat the people I'm debating with and engaging, because I keep the second coming of Christ in my mind. And I realize I can't sacrifice people for ideas that may never come to fruition, like the Stalin or whatever. And so it's an attempt for me to try to keep myself in check and always be thinking about what it would mean if Jesus came back. Am I behaving in a God-honoring way in how I write my essays and make my arguments and all of that? You can extrapolate that and apply that to anything in your life. But I think what Lewis wrote about the second coming is really all I care about. Always be ready. And that's it. So next time we'll jump back into Exodus. Until then, this is James with The World's Last Night.